Tonight, my friend Ivan joins us. Ivan brings a different perspective to the table, not only with some of his beliefs, but his education as well, that I look forward to getting his perspective on. We're going to be looking at a debate/interview between Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist and author. This interview brings a lot of valuable conversations and questions to the table. For example, morality without religion, critiques of dogma, cultural sensitivity, and one thing I'm interested in discussing in particular tonight is like the idea of community without religion. So I think there is often a belief that one can't be had without the other, so we'll discuss it and we'll see what comes up. So please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you are alerted when a new video comes out, and we will get into it. Maybe. There we go.
Does God exist? Is religion a force for good or evil? Can religion and science go hand in hand? To find some answers, I've come to Oxford, home to the oldest university in the English-speaking world and the place where I studied as an undergraduate. One of the jewels in the city's crown is the Oxford Union, the debating chamber that's witnessed such legendary orators as Winston Churchill, Benazir Bhutto, and of course, Kermit the Frog. I've come back to the Union today to sit down with the world's most famous atheist, Professor Richard Dawkins, to put faith on trial and to ask, is religion evil? Muslims riot in protest against a truly awful film demonizing Islam. Dozens are killed.
So a little bit of context to this interview. This occurred some time ago, at least 8 years ago, in a time where we had a lot of good discussion going on between people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens on religion. And that discussion has died down a bit, but I hope it comes back.
If found guilty, can be burned.
A Christian pastor in Florida tries to burn a copy of the Quran and ignites global pandemonium. Even Buddhists are at it, attacking the Muslim minority Rohingyas in Western Burma. And of course, the conflicts plaguing the modern Middle East are often blamed on ancient hatreds between the children of Abraham. Remember 9/11? Was this religiously inspired terrorism? Thousands died. Yet here's the thing. Societies without faith haven't fared much better. Communism banned all religions, as Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong systematically slaughtered millions of their own countrymen. Is science any better? Since Galileo and Darwin, scientists have sought to stamp out ignorance and unravel the mysteries of the universe. But science has also poisoned the environment, unleashed killing on an industrial scale, and now threatens our entire planet. My guest today, however, stands firmly on the side of science and has provoked controversy with his attacks on religion. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Dawkins. One of the most prolific thinkers of his generation, he shot to fame in the 1970s with his research into genetics, and his book, The Selfish Gene, transformed evolutionary biology. His most famous work, The God Delusion, sold millions of copies and has been translated into more than 30 languages. Richard, thanks so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Before we go any further, I just want to check something. Are you an atheist?
For all practical purposes, yes. Nobody can actually say for certain that anything doesn't exist. But I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaunist and an a-fairyist and an a-pink unicornist.
So you're not...
Isn't that a good way of how he frames that? To set it up, to make that contrast and make that association with those extreme beliefs. I mean, just for his sake of argument, right? It's a good way to go about it.
It was. 100% sure God doesn't exist, but you're sure enough to make it practically...
I'm as sure as you are sure that fairies and leprechauns don't exist.
And do you see an equivalence between the idea of God and the idea of a fairy and a leprechaun?
The evidence for both is equally poor.
You say in The God Delusion, one of my favorite sentences that jumps out of the page.
You got something to say?
No, I'm just listening to how he speaks, and
It is interesting, right?
it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Now, one common argument when it comes to those pro-God that you'll hear as a sort of evidence is it's almost like a grounded theory type, where it's so many people have had these spiritual or religious, experiences.
Mhm.
And because of that, that is evidence. It's an interesting way to look at it.
It is.
It's an interesting way to look at it. But then again, those in different cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
They experience those, but it's attributed to a different God
Mhm.
or
Very
different
true.
gods. So
Yes.
is it which culture is right or which God is right?
Oh, I think that brings up the conversation we had the other day. Is depending on your belief system,
Right.
that's going to be your answer.
Yeah. I find it really interesting. Because we've become so monotheistic, there is definitely, when it comes to these debates, a way to just completely dismiss older beliefs
Mhm.
with multiple gods,
Mhm.
like pantheistic. I really don't think it makes a difference. I don't really know how it is. I think the main argument would be, well, if it's so hard to have one and prove one, doesn't it make it harder to prove more than one? I don't think it does.
No,
I don't think it does.
no, not at all.
God of the Old Testament is a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully. As a piece of rhetoric, superb.
It is.
But do you really believe that?
Congratulations on getting megalomaniacal right, by the way. Most people fumble on that. Yes, if you've actually read the Old Testament, I think you would have to agree. It's hideous. It's an the God of the Old Testament who is a monster.
But also the God of the Quran, the New Testament, the Hindu scripture?
Well, the God of the Quran, I don't know so much about. The God of the New Testament is widely advertised as being a bit more gentle. And certainly, on the whole, he is. There are things about the New Testament that I find, in a way, almost more objectionable than the Old Testament. But the sheer horror of the character, I said he was the most unpleasant character in all fiction, because I regard it as fiction, of course. And yes, he is. I mean, he's jealous, he's vindictive, he's callous, he's cruel.
And yet this is a God that is worshipped by, loved by, adored by, followed by millions, billions of people.
I hope not. I hope that the God that is adored by millions of people is a grown-up kind of God who is no longer... I hope that most people the kind of people I would like to know who worship and admire him, regard those stories as not literally true. Now, there are some who do regard them as literally true, and I suspect they either haven't read the Old Testament or they're not the kind of people I would wish to know, because you do not want to worship a character like that. By all means, worship some kind of great spirit of the universe, some kind of creative intelligence who created the universe, but don't worship this vile, vindictive monster of the Old Testament.
Why throw around these sweeping statements about religion? Not the God of the Old Testament, but religion itself being evil. I mean, do you believe religion is evil?
No.
But you say plenty of times in this book that religion is evil. You said in a speech famously that I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate.
I do think that, yes. Because what I'm talking about there is faith, where faith means belief in something without evidence. Because if you believe something without evidence, then that justifies anything. You're no longer vulnerable to somebody coming back at you and saying, hang on a minute, let me argue the case. If you believe it without evidence, which is what faith is, then you don't argue the case. You say, no, I'm not arguing that case. This is my faith. It's mine. It's private. I don't dissent from it. I don't retreat from it. You're just going to have to accept it. Now, that is evil.
And yet you spend so much of your...
I think that is a powerful statement. Belief without evidence.
Yeah, that is a very powerful statement. I wished I watched more of this.
So that belief without evidence, he gets into this, I believe, in another book of his, and Sam Harris does as well, who often critiques religion, that we are biologically set up to have faith, or more specifically, attribute different things that occur to something more powerful than us. And they relate it to like an evolutionary perspective with decision making and how we choose to make decisions. So when we were evolving, and no matter your beliefs, but just in general with how we approach things, it was safer, for example, to think that something moved the grass in an area where we couldn't see, like high grass, that there may be something there, right? Rather than us going and checking and possibly getting eaten by a lion. So that type of behavior was reinforced with time to attribute something to another despite the fact that we don't see it. It's an interesting thought.
It is. Kind of grasping onto his faith thing.
Yeah.
Debating people of faith. So clearly people of faith are interested in having discussions. They're not just all blind believers insisting on their way of...
Well, nobody said anything about all of them. I mean, the vast majority of religious people are perfectly good, nice people, as you are. There's no suggestion I've ever made that all religious people are evil. Of course not. There is a logical progression that goes from believing in faith, having faith that your God tells you to do something, and doing terrible deeds, like suicide bombing, like flying planes into skyscrapers. The vast majority of people of faith don't do such terrible things. But those people who do terrible things do it believing that they are righteous and good, and they think that they're doing...
I wonder what his opinions are on the faiths and the followings where people believe in a god or multiple gods. And in some of them, like mine in particular, we don't believe that our gods tell us to do something.
You want to give a quick description of your beliefs?
I'm Norse pagan.
Okay.
So we believe our gods there's lessons to them, to each god. And there's lessons to each one. And by understanding that god and what they're about, it's more of a guide. We don't believe... I don't believe my gods ever reach out to me and say, hey, you need to do this way. I believe I resonate back onto their teachings and what I know of it, and I put my faith and my belief in it, and I choose my path. And by following that, I'm guided to where I need to be or the outcome I'm looking for. So, yeah, I don't... It's hard to explain, like, yeah, I worship my gods, during my times, but I don't pray to them. And if something good happens, I don't think they did it for me.
Really?
I think the belief in them gave me the power and the reassurance in myself to make the right steps and see it through.
Interesting.
So
I like that.
So it's not believing that anyone's going to do it for you, because at the end of the day, you're the human being that's got to do it.
Right. So would you say there's more free will in a sense rather
there
than
very much is,
rather than like divine intervention?
Yeah, for me there is. It's I'll look to depending on the situation I'm going through, I'm going to find the God that best represents that situation, you know. So in you know, what I know of them and what has been put out about them, and I'm going to apply that, you know, to not give up and see the task through, or what I'm trying to do, or what I want to accomplish through.
Very interesting.
I don't think that they reach out. You know, I do think that they're, you know, the gods I believe in are always watching, you know, but I don't think they're going, here you go.
Right.
You know,
if you see any more things like in his arguments, either with Islam or Christianity in this case, that contrast with yours, where you have a different perspective on that with your beliefs, please let us know.
The will of their God. So they're not evil people, they're actually good people by their own lights. They believe they're doing good things, and that's why religion is evil, because it can make you do evil things believing that they are good.
Do you really believe that people who go out and carry out suicide bombings, it is faith, religion is to blame, not geopolitics, not the world, not their lives, not what's going on around us, it's religion, plain and simple?
Not always, it's not in the case of the Tamil Tigers, for example. But I think in a great majority of cases it is, and I think it certainly makes it a hell of a lot easier. The evidence is plain that in many Islamic suicide bombers, you talk to them, those who fail, you talk to them afterwards, they've got paradise on the brain. They're desperate to go to a martyr's heaven. And that's what they think about.
Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago studied every known case of suicide terrorism, 315 cases. And he came to the conclusion that there's, quote, little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism or any of the world's religions. The taproot of suicide terrorism, he says, is nationalism. It's about land, it's about power, it's about politics. It's not about faith. Faith is just a cover. What do you know that he doesn't know?
Well, I've seen other evidence. There are different people say different things. I've seen plenty of testimonies of suicide bombers who have said precisely that they do it because they want a martyr's paradise.
Do you include the 7/7 bombers in that case as well?
Yes, I believe so.
Have you watched their suicide videos?
I'm not sure that I have, no.
They talk about Afghanistan, they talk about Iraq, they talk about crusades, they talk about war between the West and the Muslim world, they talk about invading armies. I mean, there's a lot of real world stuff in there. I'm not saying, of course not, that faith doesn't play a role, but I'm just interested in this idea that you think faith is the issue. You said in a very famous column you wrote 4 days after 9/11 that this came from religion.
There are enormously good reasons for people to take political action, and this we see in Northern Ireland, we see it in Afghanistan, we see it in Sri Lanka, where the Tamil Tigers operated. So yes, there are political reasons, but
I think he's leaving out a big one. Like with the U.S., there's a lot of discussion with politics here, but, you know, given, like, let's say Christianity, Islam holds different beliefs, but like at the time of conception, for example, like it happens instantly. And then the politics that come along with, you know, topics of abortion and stuff like that. I think it's left out in a lot of conversations, probably just due to their own Western bias, as primarily, I would say, there's more agnostics or atheists in the Western world.
The promise of a martyr's heaven, which is, you cannot deny that this is part of Islamic doctrine. Martyrs go straight to paradise.
Yes, but not terrorists, not murderers, not criminals.
Well, they believe that because they're told it by their imams.
But then what about the majority of the world's Muslim clerics and ulama who came out and condemned 9/11 straight afterwards?
Well, I'm delighted they did, but they were pretty quiet about it.
What about the argument that says human beings are prone to violence? They're prone to carrying out crimes against their fellow man. You can blame religion, you can blame politics, you can blame economics. Lots of factors, lots of excuses. What I don't get is, why do you only focus on religion? For fairness, why don't you also isolate the other factors?
There are lots of other factors, and I'm quite happy to say that, yes. There are lots of, I mean, if you look at the wars of history, some of them have been about religion, plenty of them have not been about religion. I never said religion is the sole cause of wars and violence.
You may not have said that, but you would accept that the new atheists, people like Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, have blamed a lot of history's wars on God and religion, and you make a similar suggestion in The God Delusion.
Yeah, I would blame a lot of history's wars, but the most terrible wars in history, the two major wars of the 20th century, are nothing to do with religion.
You accept that point?
Yeah, of course.
And the Cold War and Vietnam?
Yes, I would, of course, yes.
So when you have a situation where some of the world's worst crimes were carried out not by believers, how then does that square with your idea?
Okay, before we get into that, just want to say something about that prior conversation, as it's about really the power between belief and action, right? And one thing that I always had trouble believing is that people actually believe in such things as, you know, being a martyr and getting 72 virgins, right? Or, you know, it's the same with Christianity, same with other religions, that you're actually going to get these things.
If you do this.
Yeah, if you do this.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't think I've ever really... I believe that if I'm a good person, good will come to me, you know, and like my own thing. But I would have a hard time believing anyone who came to me and said, you're going to get this if you do this.
Right.
You know, I'm a firm believer, if you're a good person, good will come to you. If you put in hard work, it'll pay off. But if I got told to carry out any kind of weird actions or anything, I don't think I'd believe that I was going to get those things in an afterlife.
Right. It amazes me, and, you know, I think it's just due to my own beliefs and not necessarily how I was raised, but I think people are just sometimes configured differently.
Oh, we all are.
Right. And, you know, I always felt like I kind of had that part of myself, like a little bit broken. And in some ways, I wish I had that, like, ability to have that blind faith. You know, I think it would be such a comfort to actually have that. And I think people actually do have that. And to see what they're capable of with that belief, I mean, it's amazing. Whether it's true or not, it's powerful.
That it's religion that causes good people to do bad things. It's religion that's driving violence. Your original statement against religion at the start of this.
Dogmatic belief in something like religion or something like Marxism or something like Nazism, these are all, or indeed patriotism, I mean, my country, right or wrong, these are all pernicious beliefs which can drive people to do terrible things. And in the Second World War, Hitlerism was driven by racism, by a sort of sub-Wagnerian pagan religion which Hitler revived. Stalin's atrocities were motivated.
You got anything to say about that?
No,
Since you would know a little bit about that, if it's true.
No. I was... That is something that comes up a lot because of symbolisms within my faith that people see, and we're constantly having to correct it, you know, because there's certain symbolisms, runic writing, things of that nature that people see, and they automatically say, oh, well, that's, you know, that's Hitler, that's Nazi, that's it. And it gets tiring to try to explain it, that these symbolisms are so much older than that individual and that thought process, and that's not what it was about, and that they were very powerful because if anyone's done any research, Vikings were very powerful, and you know, they left runic writings, they left symbolisms all over, and some of those symbolisms, well, a lot of them were taken and used as power symbols.
Right.
And so it bothers me because I've had people look at me just because of my appearance, you know, the runes I have on my hand, which say Alu, it's protect our fate, and automatically just assumed I'm of a certain belief system.
Right.
And I have nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
I have nothing to do with it at all. I just believe in a multitude of gods in the old ways.
Right.
And that is it. And everyone assumes, oh, well, you believe in this. And I'm like, nope, sorry, bud.
That's not what really is going on.
Yeah.
By a dogmatic belief in Marxism.
And atheism.
Stalin happened to be an atheist, but he was never motivated
The
specifically.
Soviet Union was not based on scientific rationalism, on the elimination of religion and God.
Stalin persecuted the church. Stalin persecuted just about everybody.
Are you saying that the Soviet Union, the leaders of the Soviet Union, were not driven by a hatred of religion and a belief that science and human progress and materialism was the way forward?
They believed that materialism, science, human progress, those are kind of there was a Marxist slant on those words, and they were hideously misused.
Mao Zedong, when he invaded Tibet, told the Dalai Lama that religion is poison. The subtext to the late Christopher Hitchens' book was religion poisons everything. Can you blame people of religion for saying, hold on, we've heard these ideas before, that religion poisons everything and it leads in one direction?
It's an incidental fact that Mao Zedong and Stalin happened to be atheists. They
Incidental,
were not.
it wasn't core to communism.
I think it was not core to communism, no.
So when Karl Marx was talking about religion being the opiate of the masses, that was just a throwaway line.
Yeah, I mean, that was an out of context statement. I mean, what on earth do you think that's got to do with atheism? I don't know.
Let me put a statement in context to you. Albania, one of the world's worst dictatorships, tyrannies that we've seen in the last 100 years. Article 37 of Albania's communist constitution declared, quote, "The state recognizes no religion and supports atheistic propaganda in order to implant a scientific, materialistic world outlook in people."
What do you think you're saying? I mean, that's an appalling thing to say. Of course it is.
Why is that an appalling thing to say? What do you disagree with in that statement?
Why would I want to support atheistic propaganda? I support science and truth.
But you don't support spreading atheism.
I support spreading science and truth. If that happens to be atheism, I support it. I'm not going to start bullying people into being atheist. I'm not going to start trying to compel people to be atheists. That was what the Albanians were doing. It's nothing.
I think his greatest fear is ending up becoming a tool of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the things that concerns me most about having this platform, is if I become a tool for propaganda.
You put yourself in a vulnerable position.
Right? And it happens. I don't know if you heard about with Tenet Media funding different podcasters.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. It was huge.
Huh.
We'll talk about it more, but they were giving millions of dollars to podcasters. Of course, they claim that they were a victim, right? That they didn't look into it. They didn't know where the money was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But their message aligned with Russian propaganda. So they just ended up getting a check for it.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
I have to look into that.
Yeah, I'll tell you about it. I did a whole podcast on it.
Do with what I want to do.
Of course, but you'd like to persuade them not to be believers and become atheists.
I'd like to raise consciousness in a gentle, civilized way, using argument, rational argument, from evidence.
In your book, you cite lots of evidence for the bad things religion's done. What I wonder is, if you were being fair, wouldn't you have also included some of the good things that religion's done?
My passion is for scientific truth. I don't much care about what's good and evil, actually. I care about what's true. I mean, do you actually believe in your Muslim faith? Do you believe that Muhammad split the moon in two? Do you believe that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, for example? I pay you the compliment of assuming that you don't.
No, I do. I believe in miracles.
You believe that?
Yes.
You believe that Muhammad went to heaven on a winged horse?
Yes, I believe in God. I believe in miracles. I believe in revelation. I mean, the point here is...
Do you believe him? I don't.
Believe that the individual believes in those things?
Yes. As in, like, a literal truth.
Oh, a literal truth? No, and a spiritual truth, yes.
Right. I mean, he did kind of critique it as, I believe in miracles.
Yeah.
But, I don't know.
But
We'll
I see what you're saying
Yeah.
is a literal, and I think...
You know, it goes back to that whole belief and action thing, right?
There you go. I think a lot of people believe in the teachings,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't take everything literally.
Right. Do you think that they just say that in order to, let's see, how would I put it? Almost as like they have to in order to prescribe to that set of beliefs, or just to represent it?
To represent it the way it was taught to them. That's how I feel about it.
Right.
Let's assume I'm wrong, Richard. I'm wrong.
Let's
assume I'm wrong. I'm wrong. I'm happy to concede that, Richard. I'm happy to concede it. I'm wrong. All religions are wrong. God does not exist. We're all mad. The issue is we exist. We've existed for a while. I think even Christopher Hitchens said, and you've said in your writings, we're not going anywhere. So my question to you is, why not acknowledge, for example, the good things that religion has done? Do you accept that religion has done good things, despite all of our mad beliefs and our miracles?
I accept that individual religious people have done an enormous number of good things.
Not driven by religion.
Well, I mean, who knows?
You're very mean-spirited. You won't give any credit at all.
Take somebody like Martin Luther King, for example.
Reverend Martin Luther King.
Yes. Obviously, he was a cleric.
Get every point you can.
I imagine that fed into the good things that he did. Plenty of other things did. He was a great admirer of Gandhi, and he was a great admirer of nonviolence. He was a brilliant and wonderful, great man.
Would you disconnect MLK's nonviolence and Gandhi's nonviolence from their very strongly held religious beliefs? They didn't.
Well, I think it's not a thing that I really care about, actually. I mean, I think they were...
You do care about it, Richard. You're saying that people carry out violence in the name of God, and I cite to you an example of very famous people who have done good and non-violence in the name of God, and you say, I'm not interested.
If God doesn't exist, then doing something good in his name it's great that something good gets done, but there's no evidence at all that believing in God makes you more likely to do good things. I can't see any noble, logical connection between being religious and doing good things.
Let's concede that...
What was that exhale about?
Oh... There's no evidence. I'm trying to formulate how to say this. I think if you believe in a faith or in a religion that tells you to do good, and you follow that, and you're doing good, I don't see what the problem is.
I think one of the issues,
and I'm trying to get to where his evidence is, like
right.
what he's getting at about evidence.
Are you talking about from Dawkins' perspective of what evidence is, or
just watch it? Just watching this, so he says there's no evidence of it. Well, there's in all faiths, there's the teachings, and there's the 10 Commandments, and in the Catholic religion, and in the Bible. I'm not well versed on it, and he's.
So the evidence for the good things.
Yeah, for the good
right.
things. And I mean, the majority of people I know that have some sort of faith or belief system.
Absolutely.
They tend not to do things that go against how they were brought up. And if they were brought up within a faith, within a religion, and very spiritual, they tend not to be terrible. So they tend not to do bad things.
Yeah.
Everyone is capable of doing the bad things.
It's the thought of painting, that entire group. And I did look into his book. I didn't get all the way through it, and I skipped through parts of it. When I was younger, I would have enjoyed it more because there is definitely a little bit of bashing going on and not necessarily as much of an argument. But there is a good chapter in it where he gets into his field a bit that is talking about the science of belief and its relationship to why we may be prone to believe these different things. So if you just want to bash on things for a little bit, I recommend you read it. But there are much more nuanced arguments within it. In particular, one chapter, which I believe more people would find interesting. But getting back to like the good things, one thing I feel that religion does have is that community. Just like you were saying, right? There's a lot of people who do hold these beliefs, and they do a lot of good. In particular, I would say, in the community. And that brings up the question, could we still do that good without the religion?
Of course.
Me too. I think, though, that there's a lot of people, especially on the religious side, I would say it's due to their moral framework that they then do those things, which leads us more to the other side of the argument, which would be more like a secular humanist argument, and that also we are set up to do those types of things. You know, for example, you scratch my back, I scratch your back.
Yep.
You
Tick
know?
for tat.
Absolutely. That those things are just kind of baked into us.
Quid pro quo.
I don't think we necessarily have to have that religion. I do think what actually it is like a common ideology of what's best. You know?
God does not exist. Let's concede that religion is false. My problem here is trying to understand why some of the new atheists are so anti-religion when religious people clearly are doing lots of good things and they're doing it in the name of God.
I've never denied that religious people are doing good things and non-religious people are doing good things. I care about what's true. I'm an educator, I'm a scientist, and I want people to understand the truth about the universe in which they live. That's what I care about. And I regard religion as a distraction, and in some cases a pernicious distraction from true education, which I love and value the way you value and love your God.
Can you not?
So doing it in the name of God, that's where the other side, I would say, more my side would say, you're not doing it in the name of God necessarily. You're doing it for other reasons that you attribute to God, right?
Both.
Well, so long as they don't contradict
each other.
Richard. As long as they don't contradict each other. But if you actually believe Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, that's an anti-scientific belief.
And that could be wrong.
But that bloody well is wrong.
But that doesn't change. That doesn't change. How do you know it's wrong?
Oh, come on. You're a man of the 21st century.
No, I'm just asking. It comes back to my original question. The rational position is the agnostic. The rational position is the agnostic position.
Why up there? What,
the rational position. I didn't say up there. I didn't pick a place.
Okay, well, why would a winged horse be the way to get to heaven if it's not up there?
I asked a question about. You asked about proof. I'm all for saying I can't prove it, but can you prove he didn't do it? I mean, this is the end-all debate.
He didn't fly to heaven on a winged horse?
I'm just asking on your criteria. I'm just asking on your criteria.
No, I can't prove it, and I can't prove it wasn't a golden unicorn.
But I'm fascinated that you're rather talk about what animals the Prophet may or may not have used 1400 years ago, rather than talk about what Muslims or Islam is doing in the world today, good or bad. Well, that seems to be the distraction. If anyone's distracted, it seems to be you.
Well, that's your view. I'm fascinated by how somebody, a respected, sophisticated journalist in the 21st century, can believe that a prophet flew to heaven on a winged horse.
Let me ask you this. Are all people who hold beliefs in God and in miracles and the supernatural, do you regard them all as intellectually inferior to you?
I regard those beliefs as intellectual nonsense. I don't regard the individuals as intellectually inferior to me, because many of them palpably are not. If you go back in history, then all bets are off, because before Darwin, for example, it is not at all surprising that before Darwin people believed in all kinds of things which they wouldn't believe in now. There are many people, many scientists today who say they're religious. And if you actually ask them what they believe, in many cases it turns out what they believe is in some sort of deistic God, some sort of intellectual spirit, some sort of creative intelligence that lay at the root of the universe, perhaps invented the laws of physics, something like that.
I don't agree with this book, but it's an excellent book, very well argued. You're very passionate, clearly. There's one section in the book where you talk about bringing up children.
Oh, yes.
And you talked about education. You talk about a story when you tell a story about being in Ireland and talking about the Catholic child abuse scandal. And there's one quote on page 356, which I will read out to you. Horrible as sexual abuse no doubt was, the damage was arguably less than the long-term psychological damage inflicted by bringing the child up Catholic in the first place. You believe that being brought up as a Catholic is worse than being abused by a priest?
There are shades of being abused by a priest, and I quoted the example of a woman in America who wrote to me saying that when she was 7 years old, she was sexually abused by a priest in his car, and at the same time, a friend of hers, who also 7, who was Protestant, or was of Protestant family, I should say, died. And she was told that because her friend was Protestant, she had gone to hell and would be roasting in hell forever. And she told me that of those 2 abuses, she got over the physical abuse. It was yucky, but she got over it. But the mental abuse of being told about hell, she took years to get over. And
with respect, Richard, you're an empiricist, you're a rationalist. One letter from one woman in America isn't really the basis to extrapolate and make such a sweeping conclusion.
That is, of course, true. And I'm not basing it on that. It seems to me that telling children such that they really, really believe that people who sin are going to go to hell and roast forever, that your skin grows again when it peels off with burning. It seems to me to be intuitively entirely reasonable that is a worse form of child abuse, that will give more nightmares, that will give more genuine distress, because they really believe it. If they don't believe it, it's not a problem, of course.
You also say...
Let me just... I mean, I've been put on the spot about this health fire thing.
We haven't really been put on the spot. In what sense have you been put on the spot?
Well, I sense that you think it's somehow obvious that having a priest, if you're a small girl, having a priest put
I would be very interested in asking the audience whether being told about heaven and hell as a child, being brought up as Catholic, is worse than being abused by a priest.
Okay.
Let's have a show of hands. Okay. Is it worse to be abused by a priest? And if you believe it's worse for a priest to abuse a child than to bring up your child Catholic, raise your hands. Are they both as bad as each other? Raise your hands. So we have a 3-way split in the audience. Let's finish this section with one last related subject.
Okay, so 1, did you see how he turned to the audience rather than speak to him?
Mm-hmm.
It's so intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely loved it. He switched to professor mode,
Mm-hmm.
rather than this one-on-one interlocutor debate,
mm-hmm.
and spoke directly to the audience. And it's definitely required because his argument is extremely nuanced, and I think it takes on more of a utilitarian, like an overarching perspective on the effect rather than the individual. And it's a difficult argument to make because another person interpreting it may say, well, you're discounting these individual things that happen to someone,
mm-hmm.
Like you're not respecting it. Like it seems somehow disrespectful to the person who went through such a horrible thing to suggest that this on a grand scale is worse.
Mm-hmm. Don't know if I necessarily agree with his opinion on believing in the faith itself is worse than the actual physical action. Because I've known people who have gone through actual physical actions of a similar nature, may not have been religious based, and they still have yet to get over it.
Right.
And they're still dealing with it. And I don't know many people who are dealing with certain effects from religion.
Right. I think, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's a bit of a hard argument for me to buy as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, it goes back to that discussion of how much does someone actually believe in it,
mm-hmm.
right? Like, if you truly believe that you're going to get these things in the end, what are you capable of doing?
Mm-hmm.
What has occurred
mm-hmm.
because of people who, partake in those beliefs literally, whether it be suicide bombings, and the idea that you are going to burn to death,
mm-hmm.
The horrible nightmares that may occur from that and that type of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I get it.
I get the psychological effect.
But does it affect your day-to-day life like such an individual experience would have? I don't necessarily think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I don't think so. I mean, you're definitely going to have PTSD from that. You're going to have some serious traumatic things that are going to affect your day-to-day interactions with people.
On this question, a personal question from me. You talk about how to teach children that there is one God, or that God created the world in 6 days, that is child abuse. To even teach your children religion is child abuse. So, I have a daughter. I teach her about Islam and the horse. Am I guilty of child abuse?
Do you teach her the world was created in 6 days?
No, because Islam doesn't teach that, Richard.
I'm delighted to hear that.
I ask again, am I guilty of child abuse for teaching my child stories from the Quran?
No,
yes
you
or
are
no?
not. No.
Good to know. Yeah. We are going to talk more about science, and we're going to go back.
I want to talk a little bit about that.
Let's do it.
So, and this might anger some people. I'm not necessarily saying they're the exact same, but it will get my point across. Flat earthers, right? They will teach their kids this crazy conception of reality, you know? This absolutely crazy conception of reality that will affect their personal relationships a great deal. And just how they interact with society and how they get different beliefs in general, how they seek out information. And I would say that is a form of child abuse. Now, again, do these types of beliefs necessarily affect society in such a way? I mean, I don't think it is child abuse necessarily, but it sounds good, right? I think it's one of those things where it's like, let's sell it a bit, you know?
I'd say a lot of these are tough things. I know someone who is a flat earther.
Yep, me too. Right, and I found out right after I put out a video talking about how the earth is not flat.
And I argue with them constantly. And I've used different examples, and I've given up the argument because I have the ability to disagree with someone and just go, okay, that's cool. That's your belief. And I believe this way, and we're fine. I think people need to be careful on what they teach their kids. I grew up being allowed to experience all different religions. If I wanted to go to a Christian church, I could go to the Christian church. If I wanted to go to the Catholic church, I could go to the Catholic church. I could go to the Lutheran church, whatever church I wanted to go to. Then it was from my immediate family. It was very well respected, you know, that whatever I decided to do, I could do. It was the older generation of my family that said, no, you're going to be this way.
Right.
And, but I think in teachings, you've got to be careful, because if you're teaching your child something, in just my opinion, that could get them hurt, yeah, that's a no-no.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. And I definitely agree that the earth is not flat.
I would have to agree with you.
And one thing that I would like to be taken away from the podcast, and one of the purposes and underlying theme of this, is that two people can have beliefs that don't necessarily align, but that we can maintain personal relationships and still agree, you know?
Exactly.
And that is one of the purposes of this. And one of the reasons why this is categorized under politics is because I think that is a necessary thing to have right now in society for us all to get along and move towards the common good. So that's my little preaching statement.
Send it.
Audience to ask some questions to Professor Dawkins in part 2. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back. We're talking about religion and its impact on the world. Good, bad, evil. We're joined here by our guest, evolutionary biologist, Professor Richard Dawkins. Richard, science is your great passion. And you're a great believer in science. You're an evangelist for science, a promoter and defender of science. But what would you say to those people who say there are some quite important questions, genuine questions, that science cannot answer? Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? Where does morality come from? And that if religion wants to have a crack at answering those, what's science's objection?
I'm not sure I'd accept that science can't answer those particular questions. I think there are other questions science probably shouldn't try to answer, like what is right and what is wrong. Those are questions that are not the immediate concern of science. But what's the meaning of life? Why is there anything? How did it all start? Those seem to me to be scientific questions, or potentially scientific questions. If there are some questions of that sort that science can never answer, then we should at least keep trying to answer them. And if science can't answer them, religion having a crack at answering them, if there's no reason to think that religion has any basis for an answer, then why would religion have a crack? Why would you bother to listen to religion having a crack at answering them? I mean, one thing I would say is there may be questions that science can't answer, like the origin of everything. But if science can't answer them, then religion certainly can't, and nothing else can either.
Why? Why is it? It's either science or nothing.
Well, yes, because science is the method of getting at what's true. I mean, if you take something like how did the universe begin, which is a very baffling, deep question. How did life begin? Another baffling, deep question. Both those questions are unanswered. The best methods we have of approaching those are the methods of science, because these are the methods that look at evidence, that evaluate evidence in all sorts of sophisticated ways. What has religion got to do with that, other than just looking at the writings of somebody who wrote a few centuries ago? I mean, why would you bother to read those writings?
So the great philosophers and theologians in history who have grappled with these big questions and thought about spiritual issues, moral issues, the transcendent, they're all wasting their time?
Yes, they're wasting their time.
What about, why does my life have meaning? What's its worth?
Well,
where does my dignity come from?
Your meaning and your dignity are up to you, and mine are up to me, and these are not questions that science would attempt to answer. Each person finds their own meaning in their own life. And good luck to them.
And what's wrong with religion offering moral certainties, if, as you say, science can't answer moral questions?
Science can't offer moral certainty, but I don't see that religion can either.
You don't think that the religious values we have today, the moral codes we live by today, were originally derived from Judeo-Christian values, Islamic values, Hindu values?
Not really, no. I mean, things like the Golden Rule, things like treat others as you would wish to be treated yourself. These are ancient values which crop up all over the world. They've been adopted by many religions. You can find justifications for them in moral philosophy. You can find justifications for them in evolutionary biology, which is my own subject. I don't seriously think you're going to base your morality on religion, because if you do, then you've got to say, well, do I base it on Scripture? I hope you don't base it on Scripture, because if you do, then you're going to have some pretty horrible values unless you deliberately cut out those parts of Scripture which are unacceptable to modern morality.
Do you believe science is omnipotent, that it can answer all questions?
So I really kind of have an opinion on this whole moral thing, that we have to have religion to have this moral construct, right, that we have in day-to-day life. Personally, I feel one of our greatest gifts, quote unquote, that we have as humans is our ability to observe, right? One of the reasons why the heading of, this podcast and the channel is let's watch and reflect, right? We observe what's effective or what's occurring or the information that we're receiving, and we reflect upon it. We go and get good information and then determine what the reality is. And I feel and I think that most of these things that were written were observations.
I could agree with that.
That were deduced of what works.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, if we keep on killing everybody, we're not going to have people to be able to go and gather the food.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to have people to cook the food. We're not going to have, people to make the spear for the hunter.
Or to build the structures or
build
any of
the
that.
structure. Yeah.
I could agree with that.
I've already said no. I've already said it can't answer moral questions. But questions about the real world, questions about reality, questions about the origins of things, why life is the way it is, why the world is the way it is, why the universe is the way it is. Yes, science is the way to answer that.
Some of your critics have argued that you are willing to hold religion up to a very, put it under the microscope, hold it to account, scrutinize it, criticize it. You don't do the same to science or scientists or some of the bad things that have come out of science.
Well, bad things that come out of science, if by that you mean horrible weapons.
Nuclear weapons, gas chambers, eugenics.
Weapons, yeah.
We have a good question in the chat. And this is from Freddy's Little Superstar. Thank you for contributing. You mentioned, this is what he says, you mentioned striving to make things better, something along those lines. What grounding would you use for determining right and wrong in a world that's multicultural and divided? So, my interpretation of that is, again, these different cultures, these different belief systems in religion, that they are different from one to the next. And where do you find that underlying what is right and wrong? I mean, again, I would say the basis is just social interaction and the observation of what's effective and what brings about bad results. For example, killing people
brings a bad result.
Killing yourself
brings a bad result.
Hurting others. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, Freddie, or just brings up more questions, but multiculturalism is definitely an interesting topic. I got to experience that a lot in college, especially around this time when these types of debates were occurring with some of my multicultural friends. And one of the things of why I wish these conversations would be had more often is you get to find out what people agree upon, those underlying things that we can all relate to. And I think it strips away a lot of those bad effects that can occur.
These are terrible things which are technology that arises out of science, and it's certainly true that if you want to do terrible things with technology, but terrible weapons, for example, science is the best way to do it, because science is the best way to do anything. And
even bad things.
Even bad things. I mean, that's right. If you want to develop a terrible weapon, you're not going to do it in any other way than by science. The trick is not to want to develop a terrible weapon, and that's a political decision.
And you do not see science and religion as occupying two different compartments that can live side by side. They are in conflict with one another.
Insofar as religion attempts to talk about reality and has an alternative vision of reality, I think they are incompatible, yes.
Despite the fact, as we discussed earlier, many of our leading scientists are believers.
I think it's baffling. I mean, what they in practice do is they leave their religion at the door when they go into the lab. And so they get on with their science.
They say they don't.
Well, I know they do, but, well, okay.
Isn't it because religion answers all sorts of human needs and spiritual urges which science never can? Isn't that the real issue that you can't get away from?
Religion may answer human needs. I mean, for example, if you're terrified of dying, religion may answer the need for comfort and consolation. Or if you miss a loved one who's died and you hope to see them one day in heaven, then religion answers a need. It doesn't make it true.
And one last thing, and then we'll go to the audience. What do you say to those people who say, You talk a great deal about the power of science, the truth of science. You have people like Sam Harris who say morality can be determined by science. You have quite charismatic, forceful people going around the world proselytizing on behalf of science, that science is actually the new religion that you guys are pitching.
I wouldn't say it's a new religion. I mean, it certainly does some of the things that religion traditionally has tried to do, like to answer the deep questions of existence. And it does that, and it does it successfully in a way that religion never has. But it isn't a religion because it's not based upon any holy books, it's not based upon faith, it's not based upon revelation, it's not based upon tradition, it's based upon evidence, and there's a huge difference.
And anything that we do not have evidence for that's not scientifically testable, you would dismiss?
Well, scientifically testable is putting the bar rather highly, but I do think that evidence is the only good reason to believe anything, yes.
So love, beauty, aesthetics, metaphysics?
No, I mean, those are obviously important questions, and
I think that's an interesting claim. Wasn't it, correct me if I'm wrong, but that evidence is the only way to determine?
Yeah.
Something like that? Let me get that again.
And there's a huge difference.
And anything that we do not have evidence for that's not scientifically testable, you would dismiss?
Well, scientifically testable is putting the bar rather highly, but I do think that evidence is the only good reason to believe anything, yes.
So love, beauty...
There's a lot of things that we've believed, even in science, that we couldn't prove at the time, that we believed in, you know, that we couldn't prove with evidence, but that still led our inquiry. I mean, you could say
Gave you the driving passion
observation.
to find the answer.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting statement. I don't want to be too critical about it because it's just conversation.
Yep.
And that is a very deep question. But I find it interesting just because many of the things that I've sought out to answer, or even just like in this conversation that we're having, you know, there's not necessarily evidence for it. But, well, I don't know. Because much of what I argue is based on just social interaction, which is observation, which you could claim, and I believe is evidence at the same time. I don't know. I think a lot of science in the beginning was based a lot on faith, a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, I do think it has shifted. One of the biggest critiques that you end up getting from the agnostic, from the atheist side, is, of course, the God of the gaps argument, right? We can't explain it now. So we're going to fill it with God.
That's an interesting thought process.
It is.
Metaphysics.
I mean, those are obviously important questions. And if you ask some question like, how do you know that your wife loves you? It's from evidence. I mean, it's not scientifically testable evidence, but it's evidence. It's little looks in the eye, it's little catches in the voice. I mean, that is evidence. That's not just internal revelation.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. We've been talking about God, evil, war, terrorism, bringing up your children, living a good life, religion and happiness, science.
All right, before we get there, Brady's Little Superstar had another good follow-up question where he said, I see your point. How do you deter people from radical religions that see dying for their faith as a plus? Well, that's a great question, and I wish we could solve it right now.
I don't have an answer for that one.
You know, faiths evolve in time, I think, as cultures shift. I mean, we've seen that a lot with Christianity. Things that were appropriate or adopted by that faith in the past, they are no longer now. They've had to change with, actually, it's kind of funny, right? In a way, I would say it's almost political. Many of the beliefs have changed to, I think, continue to gather people to their religion, to not push people out.
Yeah, to push people away.
Yeah.
So they've had to make some adjustments.
But how do you stop people? I don't know. I would just say education
Yeah, education, talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't... someone's made up their mind that that's going to be their following. That's all you can do is talk to them.
It's definitely a generational process.
It is.
Definitely a generational process. I think we can see that a lot with what's currently going on overseas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that stuff's been going on for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. And there are generations of children now and adults who grew up seeing the other as an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And to break that, it's tough.
Versus religion. Who would like to answer the first question? Yes, you.
If the Almighty God appears suddenly on the cloud or on the earth or part of the universe, what is your reaction? Are you going to believe or are you going to go against him?
What would it take for you to believe in God, not just miracles?
Yeah, I mean...
Popping his head through the clouds.
Yeah, that's the thing I've worried about a lot. Obviously...
It would do wonders for the book.
The reason I worry about it is that obviously, as a scientist, I'm committed to the view that I would change my mind if evidence came along. And so it's a very important question. What would that evidence look like? And I've talked about it with my colleagues a great deal. I used to think, yes, if there was a great deep Paul Robeson voice coming out of the cloud saying, I exist, and then yes, obviously I would believe it. But have you ever seen a really, really good conjuring trick? There are things that I've seen done that it seems to me to be, God, that's got to be a miracle. And yet you know it's not. And so there is a real problem there that we are easily fooled.
Let's take another question from gentleman here. Very interesting guy.
There was an interesting thing that came out of a lot of this during that time, and that was what was called skepticism. And I say what was called skepticism because it became a belief system, and it was interesting to see how that type of perspective was warped almost by the flat earthers, because at about this time, when all this stuff was going on, the social movement of flat earth also kind of took off as well.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of gathered this radical concept of what was skepticism, right? Mm-hmm. That we question everything. We don't believe it unless we see it. And I don't know, it sounds like it's completely separate, but in a way, I think that skepticism, you can get to that extreme side where I'm just not going to believe it,
mm-hmm.
And I think that goes even to that middle ground point a little bit, because I found myself being like, well, I'm not going to believe that. I'm not going to believe that. I'm not going to believe that. And just beginning to shut down people,
instead of hear what they have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did that for quite a while.
Yeah.
And as I've gotten older, I've started listening to people more.
Right.
And hearing what they have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Really amused when you described faith as sort of brooking no argument. This university, of course, began with the study of theology. Most of the people here would have been studying theology at the beginning of the university, and indeed the way in which it was taught was not professorial. You didn't have lectures mostly you had discussions, debates. People didn't write monographs, they collected discussions, notes of discussions. People disagreed about their faith. Absolutely, everybody had a different opinion and everybody expressed it and everybody was heard.
What's the question?
The idea that, so the question is, do you really think that your view of faith brooking no argument measures up to really any experience of how people think about their faith? You talked about the evidence that your wife loves you. I think for most religious people, the evidence that there's a God is rather like that.
Well, obviously, I would be mad to suggest that that theologians don't argue. They argue all the time and always have. They fight wars over their arguments. So clearly they argue. I'd say, when I say brook no argument, I don't mean that they don't argue. When you say that theologians have disputes and interesting discussions, I take it that from your garb, you take a position one way or the other on whether the transubstantiation, whether the bread and wine really is the body and blood of a first century Jew, or is merely symbolic. But what evidence you bring to bear on such an argument, I cannot imagine. It would not be a real argument at all. It would be a false argument. It would not be an argument which could be settled by real evidence.
Just deal with the point about the evidence level when you referred to love of your wife.
When you say that your wife loves you, and you're getting evidence from looks in the eye and catches in the voice was the phrase that I actually used. And the questioner said, that's the way religious people feel about God. Yes, they feel that about God, but there's no evidence that they're getting any cues at all. I mean, their God is an imaginary God inside themselves. They feel that they're getting little looks from the eyes of God and sounds from the voice of God, but why should we believe them since we can't see or hear any evidence to that effect?
Let's take another question. Gentleman here in the second row.
With regards to religion, you've given an example where the Islamic faith and the Muslims basically, they wrap themselves up in bombs because that's what they believe is an Islamic faith. But I disagree with you, because there are more than 1 billion Muslims living in the world today who actually believe in the Quran and the scripture, which you said if everybody started believing in the scripture, then that would be horrible. But I disagree with you, because more than 1 billion Muslims believe that if you kill one innocent person, it's as you've killed the entire humanity. So today humanity is about 7 billion people. So more than 1 billion Muslims do not.
Contradicting beliefs. That is a big topic when it comes to religion, right? Contradicting beliefs and how you rationalize those. What's the term that I'm looking for? Not confirmation bias. It's the difference. It's when you hold a belief, but your actions go against it. And so it produces cognitive dissonance. There we go. That's psychological uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. You'd have to talk to someone that's very religious.
I almost think we should.
Yeah, I think we should too.
I think we should. We should find someone who is very religious and just have a very open conversation and ask some of these questions and see how they would respond.
I know a preacher who may be willing to do that. Because I thought about interviewing him just to get his perspective on faith and people who don't have it, who may want to have it, right? And just his thoughts on that.
That may be a good idea.
And he has a very interesting upbringing as well. He was raised during apartheid. So his social interactions and seeing how that, may have somehow affected his belief system as well, it would be really interesting, because a lot of bad things happened during that time.
Oh yeah, it'd be interesting to get his perspective, and then maybe grab a reverend or a Gothi or something like that from another faith and ask them all the same questions and to find the similarities and the differences.
Absolutely. And then demonstrate that common ground.
Demonstrate the common ground, and then maybe ask the question that we were just talking about is and you just had the word
cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. And see if they noticeably see that
right
in their faith,
and also if they feel it.
Yeah, if they feel it and how they deal with it.
Wrap themselves up and actually go and commit suicides.
The problem with many scriptures, and I think the Quran is no exception, is that you can find a verse that says so-and-so, and you find another verse that says the opposite, and so you have to you have to pick and choose. I mean, is it not the case, for example...
You always choose the bad ones.
Well, no, I mean, I'm suggesting that you shouldn't be in a position of having to choose. I mean, you shouldn't base your life on a holy book which has contradictory verses, where you can choose one verse when you want to make one point and another verse when you want to make another point. I mean, isn't it the case that the penalty for apostasy is death?
You can't take these things and just hold... I could hold up an example of, we mentioned earlier, Sam Harris has said there are some views that are so irrational, people should be put to death for them. Should I hold all atheists to him? Of course I won't hold him to all atheists to that
Let me
view.
put it to you. I mean, is the penalty for apostasy death?
No.
Good, I'm delighted to hear that. Why didn't...
And the Quran doesn't say it is.
Well, then...
Some Islamic scholars do.
Okay.
But that's debate and discussion. There's
Okay.
arguments going on. Things take place over centuries.
Okay.
Well, let's have an atheist make a point and join the debate. Lady there's waving her hand.
Actually, in the Quran, mankind refers only to Muslims and excludes infidels, which is all the rest of us. So that's a small point. But really, my question to Professor Dawkins is, how does he feel about the encroachment of all religions, extremist evangelist Christians, and a lot of Muslims into the politics and everyday life? And how does he feel about a religion trying to influence politics and public,
How do you feel about religion influencing politics and public life?
People should be free to speak their minds. I mean, I'm a great believer in free speech, and so members of parliament should speak their minds, and if their minds are influenced by their religion, then that's fine. What I would object to, I think, is the view that somehow religion has a privileged right to speak because it's religion. And I think you probably agree with that as well. If you stand up in Parliament and make an excellent speech in favour of something which religion has a view on, like abortion, say, if you make your points well and win the vote by making your points well, that's fine. But what you shouldn't be allowed to get away with is saying, because it's religion, therefore, this is what we should do.
Lady there in the headscarf.
As a social scientist, the model of the rational actor is somewhat discredited. We don't look at all actors at all times as acting rationally. In fact, we assume that they don't. But that was the prelude to my question. My question was really, would you accept that it's not so much religion that causes conflict, but sincere commitment to some belief that you think is morally important? And in that sense, do we get rid of morality?
Well, I think I partly said that when I said that in the great wars of the 20th century, these were driven by non-religious motivations, but they were driven by my country, right or wrong kind of patriotism. That's a little bit different from morality we're talking about. At least it's not religious. I was interested in what you said in your preamble when you said that I take it you're a social scientist, and you're no doubt right to suggest that since social scientists are studying the human animal, you notice that people actually don't behave rationally. Well, unfortunately, that's true. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't behave rationally just because people don't.
Let's take a question from an atheist or an agnostic. Gentleman there in the black jacket there, 3 rows down in the middle.
I think when I read your book, which I thought also was excellent, it became very apparent to me that evolution, nature, has given the human species some very, very powerful survival instincts. We're aggressive, men want to spread their genes, we want to gather as much resources together as we can to...
What's up?
I'm going to have to take a quick break and return a phone call real quick.
Yeah.
So I'll let you continue and I'll be right back.
Perfect.
To help our genes continue and survive. And as a result of that, there's been a lot of very, very dark episodes in our history. The Roman Empire, which was terribly oppressive, hedonistic, the Vikings who stole, raped, pillaged, the Persians, so on and so forth. Do you not think that it was actually the ideas of religion that took the human race, the human species, from beyond these base survival instincts and started to give them a new paradigm for thinking, which was not necessarily in the interests of the instincts that they have for survival?
It's perfectly true that a sort of selfish gene view of life, which is what I've mostly written about, is a very unpleasant view of life, and if you followed the creed of the selfish gene literally and actually lived your life according to it, it would be a very unpleasant world in which to live. It would be a sort of Thatcherite world. I mean, I've often said that while I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to explaining the way life is, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to organizing our lives.
Would the world be a better place if religion disappeared tomorrow?
Yes.
Despite all the good things we discussed, do you recognise? But you'll still have the Nazi Holocaust, the communism.
I'd be really interested in hearing people's opinion on that statement, if we would be better off without religion. Again, I think it comes back to that discussion of, can we maintain that community, which I believe that we can without necessarily a faith. Maybe rather just a faith and belief in our common good, where our mutual interests align for the betterment of society.
Wouldn't have the charities, that's fine.
You would have the charities, but I mean, it's only your assumption. But I want to finish because the questioner actually challenged me by saying that it was religion that helped us to escape from the unpleasantness of the selfish gene. I don't actually think that is true. I think that we have escaped by a long and slow process of civilization in which religion no doubt played a part. If you look historically over the very long time span of history, we're getting better, we're getting nicer, we're getting more charitable, we're getting kinder, getting less cruel. I wouldn't give religion the credit for that. I think I would give a much more complicated mixture of civilizing processes the credit for it, and religion is probably a part of that.
Okay, let's take one last question. Gentleman there in the blue jumper. We're going to have to make this the last question.
Professor Dawkins, as an atheist, is it not the case that you either believe in the universe just popping into existence without a cause, which is worse than hocus pocus, or in this thing called the multiverse, which has as much independent empirical evidence as Hades controlling the underworld?
Right. The phraseology you use is somewhat biased, somewhat slanted. The universe popping into existence out of nothing. The multiverse theory is used in this context to explain the fact that some physicists believe that the physical constants are too finely adjusted. It's as though it's a put-up job. It looks as though the physical constants are so finely adjusted that if you change any one of them, then the universe would collapse. And I started to say that. Yes. Now, the multiverse hypothesis is a kind of Darwinian way of solving that problem. It says there are billions and billions of universes, all of which have different settings of their fundamental constants. A tiny minority of those billions and billions of universes have their constants set in such a way as to give rise to a universe which lasts long enough to give rise to galaxies, stars, planets, chemistry, and hence the process of evolution.
But do you understand, it does make me chuckle that you mock me for believing in a prophet that flies into a heaven, but you believe in lots and lots of universes that you can't show me, prove to me, test to me in a lab, as a basis of getting out of believing in a God and a prophet.
I'm astonished that you should compare the two.
I'm comparing the lack of evidence for the two.
Well, you cannot use your own intuitive common sense in order to diss physics. I mean, if you could do that, we wouldn't need physicists. I mean, they are very sophisticated people. They do mathematics.
But there are physicists like Paul Davies who have dissed the multiverse theory as being nonsense.
Well, Paul Davies would rather take the view that there's something mysterious in the origin of the universe, and that's another perfectly respectable physicist's view. Steven Weinberg, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist.
It's respectable if a physicist holds a view about mystery in the universe, but not if anyone else holds it.
If we're talking about the origin of the universe, that is a problem in physics, yes.
Let's end with a couple of quick questions. If, as Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens wrote, religion is ineradicable, and as you put it, harder to get rid of than smallpox, doesn't this basically mean that whatever motivations you have, no matter how passionately you're driven and love for the truth, you are essentially wasting your time?
I would never admit to wasting my time trying to propagate the truth. And I think I can claim a modicum of success with the people that I've read my books, the people who've attended my lectures. It's a doctrine of despair to say that we're stuck with religion for all eternity. The religions of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the Vikings have all dead. Nobody believes in Jupiter or Thor anymore. And I have great hopes that the same is going to be true of the God of Abraham.
That is a tough thing to deal with. For example, are you just preaching to your own crowd? Or are you actually achieving what you want to achieve? You know, getting your message to the people who may not agree with you. That is one thing that I am concerned about, which is, I think, one of the reasons when it comes to more of the political stuff, I try and send a message of this is possibly against your, you know, mutual gain for you and your family or for those around you. That you got some skin in the game, because it changes when you got skin in the game.
Yeah. Well, when was this video made?
About 10 years ago.
10 years ago.
At least.
It's kind of an interesting time.
It was.
Then and now.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a lot of confusion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the process in PSYOP is deliver the intended message to the target audience at the appropriate time.
Okay. So I don't want people to just, you know, take that comment and be like, okay, he's talking about psyops, you know,
Nope.
he's getting all crazy and conspiracy. Do you want to say why you may have some authority in that or ability to comment on that? Maybe your background a little bit.
So in my background, I did PSYOP in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
I was a PSYOP specialist, and just listening to him, the way he talks, the things he says, the way he says them.
Which one?
Dawkins, I believe, is who's on the screen now. The way he talks, the way he delivers the message, the wording he uses, is very much to build credibility and get the message out there,
right,
to the audience, to get someone to bite, to get them thinking, to get them motivated. And for 10 years or more now, the world's been very unsettled.
It's a headline.
Yeah.
It's a headline.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It hooks you.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard a really good argument from I don't want to undermine him by just saying that he's a commentator, but he made the argument basically that it's okay that I piss people off, because if it pisses them off and they come to my channel and then they actually see the process to which I, you know, deduce my points and, you know, get my beliefs, then they're getting my message.
And
it's kind of, it's an interesting way to go about it. It definitely sold me on getting a little bit more excited in front of the camera when it comes to the podcast and changing my message a bit, because I think that that is a valid point. But it's an interesting time because, you know, we are just reading the headline and we're not getting into the process.
I could agree.
And one last thing, there's a new book out from one of this country's well-known philosophers called Religion for Atheists, which makes the case that no matter how false religion is, no matter how imaginary God may be, there are some lessons, there are some institutions, there are some values that atheists could usefully borrow.
I've heard that argument put. I've heard people say that humans do need some sort of rituals, and they need some sort of gathering places, meeting places. I can sort of see that. It's not a thing that interests me very much. I don't feel any great need for ritual. I don't feel any great need to fill the alleged vacuum that'll be left when religion goes. I think there's plenty to fill it already.
It's been a fantastic discussion. It's a pleasure to have had you here on Al Jazeera. Thank you all to the audience here.
So, one thing, after listening to what he said about ritual, I think another way that could be put is structure. You know? One thing in some other programs that I've taken part in is there's a structure. you know, and we see that like in Christianity as well. And you could call that ritual, but it's a structure for social interaction. You know, we all get together, we perform this type of intro to the service, and then we congregate and we discuss what we need to do. That community again. I think there is power in it, in that ritual, and I think it keeps people coming back.
Feels good. They like to be a part of it.
Yeah. Well, we have reached the end. You got any final thoughts or things that you want to talk about, Ivan?
I'm going to chew on this one a little bit. I think there's going to be a part 2.
Excellent. I can guarantee you people are going to want to hear more about the PSYOP stuff. And due to your background in it, your perspective on many things. I know I am.
All right.
Cool. All right. Well, for one, Freddie, thank you for your thoughtful contributions to the discussion in the chat. I really appreciate it. I will look into your suggestion about Bernardo Kastrup. I will definitely look into that. Maybe that can be that follow-up. And again, the underlying theme with this is, you know, especially now with politics, if we can find that common ground with people, for example, my beliefs are not necessarily all the same as Ivan, but I would say pretty much 95% of them are the same. It's just how we necessarily practice them, maybe. I don't even know if that's the right word. I'll have to think about it a little bit more. But finding that common ground and maintaining those personal relationships in order to foster future conversation and getting along. Getting along. Yeah.
Not letting differences divide you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.